Okay, well, let's get started. Hello and welcome. I'm Richard Kravitz, UCCS Director, and this is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. Welcome once again. Um, by way of announcements, we have only one more talk this summer, and it's really an opportunity to think about the big picture. Plagues are not new in the world, and history professor Valori Arthuri from UC Irvine will be with us to discuss what can history tell us about the potential long-run human fallout from COVID-19. So it should be quite interesting. But today we're here to learn about another threat, the effect of climate change on California's coastline, as well as some possible policy responses. This is a double header featuring our UCCS Gold Fellow, Heidi Waite, and her mentor, Professor Cascade Sorte. I'd like to say a couple things about the UCCS Presidential Gold Fellowship. Gold stands for Graduate Opportunities for Leadership Development, and it's a program of the UC Office of the President launched by former UC President Janet Napolitano that provides opportunities for UC graduate students, one of our university's most precious resources, to spend a quarter in residence in Sacramento to learn how to bridge gaps between their scientific research and policy as it affects California. Heidi Waite is the 5th Gold Fellow. And as you might imagine, since you're here, she does ocean science, but prior Gold Fellows have come from a variety of fields, including political science, education policy, social psychology, and even geology. These graduate students are doing cutting edge research in their disciplines while applying their expertise to the real world of policy. So now just a bit about Heidi. She's a PhD student in ecology and evolutionary biology at UC Irvine. She earned her BS in biology from the University of Central Florida and a master's degree in conservation and management from Oxford University in the United Kingdom. While developing a budding reputation as a specialist in, best as I can discern from her CV, in crab and mussel biology, you'll correct me if I'm off, and ecology. She's also earned a Ford Foundation predoctoral fellowship. She holds the Lowdown on Science Fellowship and has received numerous other awards. And as part of her Gold Fellowship experience, she's interning at the Ocean Science Trust, which is a legislatively authorized collaborative dedicated to accelerating progress towards a healthy and production ocean future for California. As for her mentor, Cascade Sorte, she's an assistant professor in ecology and evolutionary biology at UC Irvine. She has a PhD in ecology from UC Davis and is an early career fellow of the Ecological Society of North America. She's the author of numerous publications and holds several important grants, including at least one from the National Science Foundation. And apropos to this event, she was named Faculty Mentor of the Month at UCI in 2019. Just one word about format. As per our usual process, please raise your hands by way of the participant list in Zoom. If you're unable to do that, we can also take questions by chat, and our staff will manage the questions towards the end. So now we're looking forward very much to Heidi Waite and Professor Sorte educating us about California coastline, its problems, and maybe even some solutions. So I think we're starting with Heidi.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction. We're really excited to be here. Let me just share my screen. All right, I think it all looks good. You arrange a little bit with so many screens. All right. Well, thanks again for having us. We're really excited to be here. Also, thank you to the UC Center Sacramento and all the sort of organizers and behind the scenes that happen to make this speaker series. It's really been a pleasure to watch a lot of the speaker series as well in the past 2 weeks. As Dr. Kravitz mentioned, today we'll be talking about how climate change is affecting California coastal ecosystems. So as Californians, we have this luxury of being within a few hours to a few minutes of California's very long 1,100 miles of coastline. And in fact, about 68% of California populations live in these coastal communities. So it's not really a surprise that we benefit from and rely on these coastal environments for many different reasons, things like tourism, recreation, fishing, aquaculture, and ecosystem services that we get from these coastal ecosystems. And Californians, and indeed the rest of the country, they rely on California coastal economy. The coastal economy in California, represented here by that purple, smaller circle here, accounts for the majority of California's total economy, which is the larger blue circle. And it's worth an estimated about 45 billion annually. So it's clear to see that California relies on its coastal areas and in part its coastal natural ecosystems. And we really benefit from protecting these different habitats. So some of these habitats include kelp forests, the intertidal zone on the beaches here, estuaries, and other forms of wetlands. And all of these are impacted by human activity and are vulnerable to climate change. Many of these habitats and the animals that live there and plants that live there are in danger. As humans continue to add CO2, as we know, which is a greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere through changes like things such as land use and changes as well as, and especially burning of fossil fuels, about 25% of that is absorbed by the ocean. So how is that actually affecting the ocean? It has many different effects, and this sort of diagram made by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, really sort of highlights a lot of these, but I will focus on a couple of these and go through them. So as we said, under climate change conditions, oceans are going to become hotter with increased frequency of marine heat waves. California will also experience sea level rise, being on the coast here, and it will also become more acidic. So as the ocean absorbs CO2, that lowers the pH of the ocean, meaning the waters become more acidic. And then finally, the ocean will become more hypoxic, or meaning having lower oxygen levels, which can be harmful for many different species. And here is just sort of a collection of different headlines from different newspapers around the local areas, demonstrating some of the impacts that climate change has already had on some of these habitats. From things like the frequency of heat waves becoming more and more frequent, to acidic waters that are causing major die-offs of important marine species. But with these increasing heat waves and temperatures, how do we know how hot is too hot? British Columbia, as you might know, just experienced one of the hottest heat waves in June, and it just devastated marine life. Thousands of dead clams and snails and mussels and all sorts of other sea creatures were just found sort of dead on Vancouver Beach. As some of these news articles are shown here, they were essentially cooking to death in their shells right there on the beach. So can this happen in California? And how do we know how hot is too hot to handle? So in response to can this happen here? Yes, and it's already starting to happen. You might remember back in 2014 of hearing about the Blob, which was off the coast here in the Pacific, which was a very large mass of relatively warm water that persisted all the way into 2016. It was the largest marine heat wave in the last 40 years, and it was followed shortly after in 2019 by the second largest heat wave in the last 40 years. And just as terrifying as the Blob from the movies, this Blob had many negative effects on marine life. Things like crashes of several fisheries like sockeye, sardines, and the Dungeness crabs. It also caused a lot of sea lion strandings as they searched for the sardines that were no longer there. Also seabird die-offs and harmful algal blooms, so pretty devastating. And still, the historical data and the models that we use have shown and predict that these events are going to become more and more common. So will we experience a drastic, crazy die-off as we saw in Vancouver in the near future? We'll see. But we know that climate change is happening, but what is it that we don't know that could help us predict if something like that would actually happen? This is just a simple framework for tackling climate change in coastal environments. So first, we need to be able to predict how fast these changes are going to occur in the climate, and then how species will respond to these changes, what those impacts are to species and their ecosystems. And then from there, we can make better decisions and implement key policies and different management practices. In this talk today, we will focus mainly on that second box there of understanding how climate change will affect species and ecosystems. So how do we predict the responses of coastal environments and organisms under climate change so we can better inform decisions in ocean policy in California? Well, here are some of the things that we came up with. First, we must understand how species are going to cope with these key stressors like temperature. How hot is too hot to handle for ocean animals and plants? And then secondly, we need to study the potential for species and populations to buffer climate change effects. So could sea plants be sheltered from harmful acidic water? And then finally, we need to better predict and understand how species will move in response to climate change. There's going to be lots of species moving and new species basically in the neighborhood. And are they going to be invaders or are they going to help? So I'll start off by considering what conditions are too hot to handle for ocean animals and plants, and how we might use this knowledge to predict their survival in response to crazy heat waves like we just saw in the Pacific Northwest and in British Columbia. First, the loss of some species have major effects on ecosystems and therefore are really important to understand how they will fare under climate change. One of those groups are called foundation species. And foundation species are plants and animals that play a strong structuring role in the community. So sort of similar to the foundation of a building or foundation makeup, these species form the base of an ecosystem. They provide structure and support for the ecosystems. They also support really high levels of biodiversity normally. So for example, oysters, which are on your left, and mussels, which are on your right, both create habitat for other species to live among that wouldn't be there otherwise. So for this California mussel on the right there specifically, over 300 animals and plants rely on those mussels for habitat and for food. Just based on this little picture, it might be hard to see, but you can already see that there's lots of barnacles and other little critters in there, as well as snails and crabs all hidden among those mussels. And overall, both oysters and mussels are important food sources for shorebirds, crabs, and others. Marine vegetation can also be foundation species, including from left to right, rockweed, seagrass, bull kelp, and giant kelp. And they all create habitat and shelter for other species, but they also modify environmental conditions like light exposure and temperatures. Rockweeds, for example, create damp, cooler environments for hermit crabs, anemones, and other species to shelter during those really hot, low tide parts of the day. So given their role in creating habitat and supporting biodiversity, foundation species really need to be protected. But unfortunately, many are actually in decline. So for example, mussels in California, on the California coast here, are in decline. Between 1970s and the year 2002, mussel cover declined by an average of 40% along the California coast. And based on what I just told you, you're probably not surprised to hear that the diversity or the number of species that are found within the mussels also declined. So to give you a better sense of this, imagine a section of the mussel bed the size of a dinner plate, for example. In the 1970s, you would have found almost 90 different species, but now you'd find less than 40 species. So this shows how important the loss of foundation species are and how drastic effects they can have on the whole community when lost. Bringing it back to British Columbia's recent heat wave, we observed a huge loss of mussels there as well. And the mussels and lots of other animals, they just didn't make it. They essentially boiled to death right there on the beach. So how do we predict how hot is too hot, especially for those important foundation species like these mussels? One potential framework for thinking about how to address this is by combining measurements of sensitivity and exposure of those organisms to these environmental conditions to give us a sense of their vulnerability to, let's say, temperature or ocean acidification, or etc. And here, sensitivity is basically an individual's ability to survive the stressors like heat, acidification, and so on. So how much heat can they handle before they die? And this really depends on their physiology. Exposure here is essentially what are they actually experiencing in the field? What kind of temperatures are they experiencing? Do they actually experience? And this can be measured using field measurements of local habitat conditions, even within one site, one beach, across latitudes and over time as we see changes in the climate. And our lab studies a lot of these elements of vulnerability to figure out how these species will fare under future climates. So to predict sensitivity or the survival under stress, we test mussels across their different life stages to determine the hottest temperatures they can survive under, sort of that max temperature that they can deal with. And then we also combine these sensitivities with field measurements of the temperatures that they're actually experiencing in the field and under different sort of habitat types as well. And then combined, these metrics give us the ability to determine which populations are more at risk of rising temperatures, especially, or heat waves, and then can be used to understand and make management decisions. So how do we actually measure temperature in the field for mussels? We use these things called temperature loggers on the left there, which are just little machines that record temperature. They can also be, and they're usually bolted into the rocks near the mussels. We can also use robo mussels, which are pictured on the right, and these mimic sort of the real mussels, but have loggers inside that you can place them within the mussel bed as well. So sometimes these mussels are experiencing temperatures they can't handle. I tested mussels from Southern California here in near Irvine to figure out how much heat they could handle. I found that most adults died between the temperatures of 30 and 35 degrees Celsius, but mussels were out on the beach were sometimes experiencing temperatures up to 44 degrees Celsius during low tide times. Our lab also investigated how the temperature at which mussels die, or their tolerance essentially, differed across different life stages. So mussels, if you're not familiar, have several different life stages, which are pictured on the left here, which include a larval stage and then a juvenile stage that grows into an adult. And each stage looks a bit different and has different physiological needs. And the lab found that older mussels don't die as easily in the heat as younger ones. So the adults sort of can survive up to 35 degrees Celsius or so, and then the juveniles and sort of recruits or early juveniles much lower at 24 degrees Celsius. So adults are dying at higher temperatures than younger life stages, which means that younger stages are more sensitive to temperature increases. We can also combine how temperature they experience or that exposure and how well they cope with it and sensitivity. We can combine those to determine which populations or areas of the beach might be more at risk, especially during times of like heat wave. This can, like I said, help managers figure out where and when to protect mussels. So here's an example of how to combine these two metrics as a tool for determining which are most at risk. Within even a beach, small scale changes in environmental conditions can determine how much heat mussels are actually experiencing and how well they can cope with it. So just like humans at a park on a nice day, mussels in the intertidal are typically found in 4 different habitat types, which I will use that humans in a park metaphor to explain these different habitat types. But generally, sort of this single by themselves, mussels can be by themselves. They can be bunched together with other mussels. They can be found sort of within algae or other ocean plants or in tide pools. So using that metaphor of the park, mussels can be found in single, sort of by themselves, much like this person over there in the corner all by themselves, enjoying the view. Or sometimes they can be bunched together like these folks here, or they can be surrounded by algae or other plants, so sort of like these folks under the trees taking advantage of the shade. Or finally, mussels can be found in tide pools, which are always covered by water even at low tide when the water is out. So in this case, in the picnicker example, it might be if someone were swimming in the lake. So to measure how much temperature each of those different habitats are experiencing or that exposure, our Dr. Lauren Pandori, a recent graduate from our lab, measured temperatures by placing the data loggers, like those I showed before, out into the field in each of those different habitats. Then she measured how much heat the mussels could deal with, or basically their tolerance to these temperatures. And Lauren found that mussels in these solitary habitats, these by themselves habitats, were more at risk. The temperatures that they experienced or that exposure was higher than their ability to deal with that temperature or sensitivity. That she found, though, were found in less hot or less exposed habitats, like in the algae or the bunched together type habitats. But with the increasing temperature and those increased heat waves paired with that mussel loss that I talked about earlier, these habitats, these buffering habitats are becoming less common and might not be available under future climates, which leaves mussels in danger of exposure to temperatures that are just way too hot for them to handle. So this was a good example of showing that by combining sensitivity and exposure, we can determine which mussels and maybe which sites are more at risk. Maybe those sites that have fewer bunched or habitats with algae might be more at risk than other sites that do have more of those buffering environments. And other factors like human use and trampling can further worsen these negative effects of climate change. So a study found that sites with higher human use, sort of visitation, etc., had 20% lower cover of mussels and generally saw smaller mussels. And these effects, in combination with the vulnerability metrics that we just talked about, with sensitivity and exposure, can help us better inform management and sort of protect certain populations, especially during heat waves that might be especially vulnerable. Another important foundation species that has been impacted by these increases in sea temperature in California is kelp. So beginning in 2014, which was that Blob event, that Blob event devastated kelp forests in Northern California. So here in these little diagrams here, the green represents kelp cover, and these are several different locations in Mendocino County and Sonoma County. So we can see as I click from 2018 to 2014, we saw a 90% loss of bull kelp canopy. That green just is gone in the second picture. And this loss of kelp also devastated two lucrative fisheries. So one, the recreational fishery of abalone, which is estimated worth of $44 million, and the red sea urchin fishery, which is estimated about $3 million. So this shows that the loss of foundation species like kelp not only affects the ecosystem, but also the economy. And finally, the effects of these foundation species are really important. Not only will they affect their own population, their own little communities, but this will scale up to larger communities and ecosystems as a whole, and can have much larger impacts overall. So thus, it's important that we continue to research the physiological tolerances of these important foundation species. How much heat can they actually handle, or how much ocean acidification, etc., can they handle? Also, researching best practices for restoration of those species lost, such as those kelp forests, how to restore them with high success. And finally, research organisms' potential to actually adapt under climate change, which all of these will improve our understanding of the climate impacts of California on ocean animals. And this closely aligns with sort of California's goals for protecting ocean and coasts. It aligns with the Ocean Protection Council's strategic plan, objective 1.3, of improving understanding and really investing in this research. And on a higher level, California really needs to continue to support and expand monitoring programs in order to better protect vulnerable populations, especially, like I mentioned, during those intense heat waves. And restoring habitats through establishment of foundation species is also really important. Legislation such as the Kelp Act, or the acronym meaning Keeping Ecosystems Living and Productive, would dedicate funds towards restoration projects, especially those focusing on kelp. And just like in the previous one, OPC's strategic plan has two objectives, 3.1 and 3.2, that also call for restoring foundation species like kelp and seagrasses. And then finally, understanding the vulnerability of populations using that combination of sensitivity and exposure possibly could help inform marine protected area designs. And so overall, these are really important aspects of California policy that can be looked at. And sort of these that I outlined here are very closely aligned with the goals that California already has through OPC. All right, and now I will turn it over to Dr. Cascade, Sorte, who will continue our presentation.
All right, let me just get set up for a second. All right, so Heidi has told us about how the survival of a species depends on their tolerances, and how understanding species tolerances can help us to understand whether species are going to be able to cope with global change. So I'm going to be telling you two other stories related to global change consequences and coping in California's coastal ecosystems. And the second story I want to talk about is addressing whether or not we can mitigate global climate change locally. So Heidi set up this framework that we could use to understand the consequences of climate change. And we can understand a species' vulnerability by thinking about its sensitivity, or what kinds of conditions it can handle, and its exposure, exactly what conditions it's exposed to. And here I'm going to focus really on the exposure part of this puzzle. So one thing that's really important to understand this story is that exposure itself occurs at local scales. Even though when we're thinking about climate change, we tend to be thinking about a global process. So global climate change is the process that happens when people put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that leads to increases in global temperatures. And that certainly affects our local climate conditions. But what the organisms or the species are experiencing is those local conditions. Now, of course, the best way to address climate change would be to turn off the tap at the beginning, basically to put less greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, to stop putting so much CO2 into the atmosphere, and that would help things locally as well. So hopefully that's the direction that we'll be going as a society. But in the meantime, while we're doing what we need to do to turn that off and investing in renewable energies, et cetera, we can make some progress locally by focusing on the local climate conditions that our coastal species are experiencing. So we can take this back to the metaphor that Heidi used earlier in the talk. And it's really important for us to understand that the exposure at local scales can be influenced by vegetation. It can be influenced by a lot of things, but I'm going to focus on vegetation for the purpose of this talk. So if you think about a record-breaking day, say a 100-degree day, we've had more and more of those recently, and you happen to be going out for a picnic, imagine yourself at the park. Where are you going to be setting up your picnic? Are you going to be setting up your picnic in the middle of this open field, or are you going to migrate more and set up your picnic underneath the trees where there's shade and canopy, and where those hot temperatures are mitigated or lessened by that vegetation, in this case, the trees? So I'm someone that's going to be focusing on the trees. I don't want to get sunburned. I don't want to be so hot. I want to mitigate my exposure to the climate conditions. So that's a metaphor with temperature, but the similar things can happen actually with carbon dioxide levels. And I want to talk to you about whether or not marine vegetation can influence local CO2 levels and acidity. So here's a little animation to show you how this would work. So we're not talking about temperature anymore. Now we're talking about levels of carbon dioxide and the impact of that on the acidity of the ocean water. So as global carbon dioxide levels increase in the atmosphere, that affects the level of carbon dioxide in the ocean, and it affects the local ocean carbon dioxide levels. If those levels of carbon dioxide in our local ocean increase, the local ocean will become more acidic. And this has a lot of potential negative effects on our local species. We've seen, for example, that more acidic waters will lead to corrosion and weaker shells of our shellfish. That leads to higher mortality. It leads to less growth because they have to put more energy into building their shells, etc. But what if, when we increase CO2 levels, and even though that ocean water becomes more acidic, what if that marine vegetation could actually use that increased carbon dioxide and photosynthesize faster, meaning use that carbon dioxide faster? Remember, photosynthesis is that process by which plants will take up carbon dioxide and turn that into sugars. So if those plants, if that marine vegetation could increase their rates of photosynthesis when there's more CO2 around, then they could actually help us by decreasing the carbon dioxide levels in the ocean water and potentially making it less acidic. So this is a way that potentially that marine vegetation could influence the carbon dioxide levels, influence the acidity, and maybe keep it within conditions that are more tolerable by the other ocean critters. Well, we have seen some evidence that this is true, that marine vegetation can influence local CO2 levels and local acidity. So I hope that you will not mind that I've put some data slides on these in this talk. I really love to show data. It's the way that I feel I've really gotten the point across, but I will say in words what all of these graphs are saying. So if you don't want to look at them, you can just listen to what I say. So this graph right here is showing you one case where marine vegetation is influencing local carbon dioxide levels and local acidity. And this is a figure that just shows the pH levels or the acidity of a single tide pool. So I've outlined that single tide pool on the top figure, on the top photo in blue. And you can see that that tide pool is pretty much filled up by some green stuff. This is marine vegetation. It's a species of surf grass. So if you went out and you measured pH in that tide pool over time, so on the left is earlier here, and on the right is later in time, you would see that the pH in that tide pool goes up. Higher pH means that it's less acidic. And thank you to Heidi for putting this little cheat sheet on the bottom left of your slides, which shows you that as you increase carbon dioxide, that leads to a decrease in pH, which means an increase in acidity. But I've also put on all of the figures here some text to help you follow as well. So here over time, this tide pool that has a lot of marine vegetation in it is becoming less acidic. And that's because that marine vegetation, that surf grass, is taking up the carbon dioxide. So this tide pool with a robust population of vegetation becomes less acidic over time because that carbon dioxide is being taken up by photosynthesis. So this is an example from a single tide pool. A previous postdoc in the lab, Mrs. Silberger, who's now a faculty member at Cal State Northridge, she went out and she studied tide pools across the West Coast from Southern California up to Central Oregon. She did measurements in 60 tide pools at 4 locations across that gradient, and she found the same pattern across those 60 tide pools. She found that tide pools with more robust populations of vegetation were always less acidic. So you can see that on this graph here. On the right side here are tide pools with more vegetation. On the left side are tide pools with less vegetation. And when you have more vegetation, you have a higher pH, which means those tide pools are less acidic. So this is evidence that marine vegetation can help by influencing those local CO2 levels and that local acidity, particularly by making those tide pools less acidic. But we still might wonder, can marine vegetation mitigate climate change? Because the previous data I was showing you was under natural conditions. What if we add more carbon dioxide? What if we basically make these tide pools more acidic and make them sort of simulations of future climate change? Well, this is something that we did in collaboration with postdoc Silberger and another collaborator from UC Irvine, Matt Bracken. We went out to the tide pools at Bodega Marine Reserve on the northern central coast, and we experimentally added carbon dioxide to 10 tide pools. And we found a similar pattern. We found that tide pools with less vegetation became more acidic. But tide pools with more vegetation were able to mitigate that carbon dioxide addition and become less acidic. And if you want to take a look at the figure here with me, you can. So again, here on the right side are tide pools, which are these blue dots here. These tide pools had more vegetation, whereas the tide pools here on the left had less vegetation. The tide pools that had less vegetation here became more acidic. They had lower pH levels when the CO2 was added, but the tide pools on the right here became less acidic when the CO2 was added, meaning that CO2 caused them to increase their rate of photosynthesis, so they were able to take more CO2 out of the water and help to mitigate that climate change. So this is some evidence from work in my lab, and that's really what I'm focusing on today is work that I know the best, that has shown that marine vegetation influences local CO2 levels and acidity, and indicates that robust populations of marine vegetation could mitigate climate change locally. Now, although I've been focusing on my own research, I want to direct you to this report that was commissioned by the OPC and the Ocean Science Trust. The report is on understanding seagrass and kelp as an ocean acidification management tool in California. And this was published sometime in the last 3 or 4 years. And the main summary, or I think one of the really important takeaways from this report, is that investing in the protection and restoration of marine vegetation is a no regrets coastal management strategy for maintaining functional, resilient ecosystems in the face of climate change. No regrets, meaning it's all benefit, right? And so not only will adding those forms of marine vegetation potentially increase diversity. As you saw, these foundation species are really important for maintaining diversity, but it could also help to mitigate climate change. And I also want to draw your attention to an assembly bill that is currently under consideration. My understanding is that it's currently with the Senate committee. And this bill states that in marine managed areas, it will authorize the designating entity or managing agency of those marine managed areas, which include marine protected areas, to also permit restoration and monitoring among their activities. So right now, the wording is that conservation measures are allowed, but not restoration and monitoring specifically. And I'm aware of 2 restoration projects that were funded in California state and were going to be done in marine protected areas, but could not be because of the lack of this bill. One on kelps and one on rockweeds. And so it's really important that we pass this bill so that we can start moving forward and restoring some of that marine vegetation. Again, this is a no regrets action, and I'm hopeful that this bill will be through soon. So just to keep summarizing, we've talked about how the survival of species depends on their tolerances. We've talked about how marine vegetation might be able to mitigate climate change locally. And now I just want to tell you one last story. And this is talking about what happens when new species arrive on the scene. So as the climate changes, many species are declining, and this includes foundation species of shellfish and vegetation. And you've seen this throughout our talk. You've seen examples of declines in shellfish, of marine mussels along California's coast, and you've seen examples of declines in marine vegetation, including kelps that declined during the Blob. But unfortunately, actually, as the climate changes, not all species are declining, some are increasing, and unfortunately, it tends to be species that aren't necessarily supposed to be here, including invasive species. So invasive species are non-native species that have been transported to the California coast by human activities. And these non-native species invasions cost the global economy a ton in both their control and their management, as well as lost revenue. So these are a couple of figures that I was able to find that are recent. Marine invasions cost the global economy billions last year. And in San Francisco Bay, just specifically, the control of a single species, this is Spartina cordgrass, has cost over $34 million to date. And some of these costs are incurred in dealing with fouling species, like these species that you see in the photo. These are species that live on the bottom of boats and docks. They also live on natural surfaces, but they become more problematic when they're fouling our human infrastructures. And a lot of the species that you see on these infrastructures tend to be invasive species. So here's just an example of work that I did when I was a PhD student at UC Davis. I was doing work in Bodega Harbor and comparing the number of native and invasive species in the harbor between the 1970s and when I was working in 2006. And you can see that back in the 1970s, the great majority of species in the harbor were native. However, when I arrived there in 2006, the majority of the species had shifted to being invasives. So climate change is playing a role in promoting invasive species in these coastal communities. And climate change is also causing native species to move into new locations. As our coastline becomes warmer, there are species that couldn't live here before because there were parts of our coastline that were too cold to allow them to live here. But as it gets warmer and warmer, it's becoming a better habitat for those species, essentially moving north. I guess one similar example would be how people in Oregon feel like Californians are moving north. Do you think that's likely to happen more as the climate changes? I'm not sure. But let me give you an example of a coastal species that's shifting its range. And this is a species called the dark unicorn whelk. You can see it's outlined here in yellow. This is a species of predatory snail, which might not look vicious to the naked eye. It's not that big. Here I am holding one. But these snails, they're vicious carnivores. They feed on other shellfish by drilling a hole in them using this little unicorn horn here that's sticking off of the shell. and then basically sucking the meat out of that shellfish, especially mussels and barnacles. This species is from Baja California in Mexico. Before 1970, it only extended as far north as just below the US border. In the 1970s, it arrived in San Diego. And since then, it's continued to extend its range up into Orange County. So these species that are shifting their ranges or changing where they live due to climate change are something that we might call a climate invader. Humans are not necessarily picking them up and transporting them, but our activities in causing climate change are providing a better habitat for them further north. And so that's why we use this term climate invader. And some of my work has shown that the impacts of these climate invaders can be as strong or stronger than those impacts of non-native invasive species. This is from a review paper that I wrote showing the impacts were similar between the native climate invaders and the non-native invasive species, and that's across different species of shellfish, seaweeds, squids, birds, urchins, and parasites. So how do we anticipate the impacts of these climate invaders on our resident species? And can we use risk assessments that were developed for invasive species to understand and anticipate the impacts of these climate invaders? Well, one impact assessment protocol that we've been using in our lab is the ICAT protocol. This is the Environmental Impact Classification of Alien Taxa. It's the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, standard for classifying the impact of alien species on the environment. And it classifies these impacts on a qualitative scale from minimal concern up to massive concern. And our work is the first example of using these risk assessments to understand or anticipate the risks of these climate invasions. So these risk assessments were used by my lab to reveal that these climate invasions have both costs and benefits. We studied 39 climate invaders in North America, and of the 50% of them impacted our resident species by impacting their growth, their abundance, or their population viability. And I just wanted to show this figure to give you a sense of, where different species fell along that continuum from negative to positive impacts. So on this figure, each one of these lines is a different species, and the negative impacts are shown in red and the positive impacts are shown in blue. The size of the bar here shows how strong those impacts are. So a more negative impact is a larger bar, a more positive impact is a larger bar. And one thing I thought was really interesting and important about this study was that we showed that most of these impacts were negative. However, about half of the species that had impacts had both negative and positive impacts. And here's an example of that. This is the mangrove species, not a California species, but this was a study that was focused on all of North America. This mangrove species has some benefits. It's a foundation species. It provides habitat for other native species such as parrotfish, but it also had some negative impacts as well. In fact, it served as refuge for a lot of invasive species and actually affected the non-native species invasions in the area as well. So pros and cons of having these new species around. And one other question that we addressed in this study is, can we anticipate these impacts of these climate invaders before they invade? And the answer to that seems to be yes. We found that the impacts from studies in the native range of these species before they've even started to move into new areas with climate change are pretty good indicators of the impacts in their new expanded range. And that's shown by this figure on the right. If you basically knew the native range impact, you could put that native range impact, along here, and then you would match it up using this red line with the expanded range impact here. So this suggested that using this ICAT risk assessment for range shifts was possible. It does require some modification. We had to, for example, use studies from the species native ranges, not just their invaded ranges, as is done for the invasive species risk assessments. So if anyone watching this webinar is interested in employing this approach, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to give you some information in advance of the publication of this paper which is currently in press at Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. So these risk assessments developed for invasive species can be modified as a tool for anticipating the impacts of climate invasions. Ideally, they would be combined with vulnerability assessments for those impacted resident species. For example, as you can imagine, if a climate invader is having impacts on a resident species that is in danger of extinction, that would be more of a concern than a resident species that already has a robust population. And we think that using this approach, by using a risk assessment approach and combining this with vulnerability assessments, would be helpful for informing the evaluation and prioritization of policies and management actions. And I'll mention that even though one of the OPC objectives is to control invasive species, I don't believe that there's anything in there about species that are shifting their ranges with climate change. So this is becoming a really interesting gray area that I think is going to become really policy relevant as we move into future climate change. So that finishes the information portion. Now I just like to sum up what we've talked about today about some of the consequences of global change for California's coastal ecosystems and how we might figure out whether those ecosystems are going to be able to cope, or how we could help them to cope. First, Heidi talked about how the survival of species depends on their tolerances, and by understanding their tolerance limits, we might be able to predict their survival, and by understanding their adaptation ability, we might be able to predict whether they'll be able to cope in the future. Secondly, I talked about how marine vegetation can actually mitigate climate change locally. This is a no regrets policy. It's a way that we might be able to sort of stem the tide of the impacts of climate change while we're trying to turn off the tap of increasing greenhouse gases globally. And in order to make sure that these marine vegetation populations are robust, we need measures to conserve and restore them. And finally, these climate invasions are occurring, and they have costs and benefits. And so I would propose that we need watch lists for the species that are likely to shift into California's coastal ecosystems, and risk assessments of those species likely to arrive, so that we can predict whether those arrivals will be more like peaceful coexistence or hostile takeover. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your attention. And I would like to leave this slide up for just a couple of minutes, so that if you're interested in reaching out to myself, again, my name is Cascade Sorte, or Heidi Waite, you have our email addresses here, our websites, and our Twitter handles. I'd also like to thank NSF for supporting both of these projects. I'm also hopeful that a recent proposal to NSF, which has been recommended for funding, will come through, and that would be to study these climate invasions. And so I hope you'll stay tuned for more work from our lab. And with that, I'll turn it over to the organizers to help coordinate.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Sorte, and then Heidi, for just a fantastic presentation today. We are going to move over into Q&A, but before that, we want to go ahead and just give Sandra just a minute here to go ahead and stop our recording.